my elder sister and I have been working very hard on pulling together family history for those who come after us. And as part of that project, over the last 10 years or so, we discovered some things that nobody ever talked to us about. And we discovered and learned some things that we want to share. And what nobody ever talked about was the life of our grandparents and our parents. They were in their late teens and early 20s at the time, under the Nazi regime in Germany. There's a number of things we are going to go through, but there are two questions I'd like you to keep in your mind. When is it too late? And can you sell your soul to the devil just a little bit? So keep that in mind as we go through. Now, here is a boatload of stuff. We are not going to be able to spend much time on anything, but I need to set the stage a little bit on what life was like in Germany after World War I. And from then, how the Nazis came to power as quickly as they did. And then we can dig into what I really want to talk about. And then, of course, there has to be an epilogue with some further items, food for thought. The general historical context, end of World War I, November 9, 2 days before the armistice, the First German Republic was proclaimed. In 1923, on November 9, Hitler and the Nazis staged a coup attempt in Munich to try to overturn the Bavarian state government. Didn't succeed, earned him some time in prison. And we'll get to that a little later. November 9 in 1938 was the rampage throughout Germany, in which synagogues, Jewish-owned storefronts, and homes were not just almost obliterated. November 9 is quite a date in German history. And November 9, just to continue that, is when the Iron Curtain opened up in Hungary, of all places. That is now one of the showcases for an authoritarian regime. And November 9, no, that was the last one. Sorry, I thought there was one more. So
today.
Yep, today. Thank you. That's why November 9 is on my mind. From a German perspective, the conclusion of the peace arrangements in the Treaty of Versailles were highly punitive. And I think it's fair to say, from a historian's perspective, they were meant to be. It's debatable to what extent Germany was guilty of starting World War I. That's for another lecture, another day. But the key items that were written into that treaty, heavy reparations to be paid by Germany to the victorious allies, and a significant deindustrialization of Germany. Heavy industry, of course, was a major source of power during the war. And one way of dealing with that is, let's get those factories demolished and moved out. As a result, was tremendous economic hardship. The reparations, of course, well, somewhere that money had to come from. Germany encountered, unlike the US, a period of hyperinflation. I remember an anecdote, and we may run into overtime today. I beg your forgiveness and willingness to stick with it. I remember an anecdote from my maternal grandmother. She had gone out, cash in hand, to buy a little table. She talked to the salesman, says, "I'll take it." Salesman gets called away, comes back and says, "I'm so glad you said you'll take it, because the price just doubled." Okay. That's the kind of inflation we are talking about. There is no other nation in at this time in the last few decades anywhere in the world, no matter how bad their inflation was, that has gone through anything like that. It was basically somebody gave you money, you turned around as quickly as possible to get rid of it, because 10 minutes later it might not be worth all that much anymore. And then just as the Germans got that back, currency, got that back under control, 1929 hit. And you all know 1929 and the stock market crash, nothing more I need to say about that. Hit in Germany just as badly as it hit here. Oh, that's the one date I forgot. They were in a brand new democracy on November 9, 1918. The Democrats proclaimed the so-called Weimar Republic. Weimar is a city in former East Germany, and that's the place where that republic was proclaimed. That was the end of the imperial regime in Germany. So we got a brand new polity where nobody knows what they are doing, that had to be built on the fly very quickly. And it turned out to be tremendously unstable. It was at the time one of the most freedom for individuals, political freedom, whatever you want, freedom, constitution in the Western world. But it had one fatal flaw. It allowed just about anybody to set up a party, and just about anybody who could gather a small number of votes ended up with a representative in the parliament. So what we had was a huge number of parties in parliament, and they couldn't get together to come to some sort of, here is how we go forward. And over time, under all these pressures, the reparations, the hyperinflation, the depression, it just got worse and worse. And if you look around that pattern of a small party, 5 or 10% of the votes in a parliament holding the whole parliament hostage, you can see that in many modern democracies. This is not unique. This is the way, unfortunately, it goes. Now, a little bit of polyscience here. Ernst Fraenkel was a Jewish lawyer in Germany. He was a soldier on the front in World War I, and he was hence given special privileges by the German government, that even though being Jewish, he could practice law. And there's a wonderful article on him on Wikipedia, which I recommend you read. On what? Wikipedia. Okay. I can't go into all the detail. And he eventually fled Germany to London and then US. And before he fled, he wrote up a treatise that became known as the dual state. And what he identified was that the state basically split itself. There was the civil state as we know it. You marry, you buy a house, you sell a book, you butcher a cow, sell the meat, you sell a farm, you buy a farm, you die, kids are born, the civil life as we know it. And that was allowed to continue to exist and go forward as long as it didn't conflict with the other half of the state, which he termed the prerogative state. And that was, of course, the ideology state, which is no Jews, no communists, no, and the list is yea long. If you tried to sell a farm to a Jew, wasn't going to happen. If an Aryan was going to try to marry somebody with Jewish heritage, wasn't going to happen. If you had a board of directors at a bank, as one of my grandparents did, that had, of course, Jewish members, was common. They were not allowed to continue to serve. So what Frankl observed is these two structures that coexist, intertwine, and where ultimately the prerogative state has its fingers into every aspect of human life. Even the most simple civil things, as that marriage, buying or selling something, if one of the parties wasn't clean by the standards of the ideology, was it? Now, here is a brief sequence of events of what happened in 1933. On 30th of January, Hitler is nominated to become chancellor. The German government structure is a little bit more like the British. There is a head of state, the president. In Britain, that's the king or queen. And that person is to some extent a figurehead, just there. Underneath is the government. In France, the head of government. In Britain, it's a prime minister. In Germany, it's called chancellor. That's where the real power of government resides. The president in the German system has to sign off on any laws finally, after they've all been passed and what have you. He appoints or receives resignations from government officials, but the role is really more like the conscience of a nation than a powerful politician. So in January of 33, Hitler becomes chancellor on the recommendation of the prior chancellor, with the assurance to the president that they were able to control Hitler and that would be okay. 4 days later, on the 4th of February, Hitler obtains from the president the first of two emergency orders for the protection of the German people. That suspends the right to assembly, freedom of the press, and the original excuse for that is, let's not give the Marxists any kind of a platform in public life. But of course, the law didn't say that it was targeted to Marxists only. It was global. Next big step, February 27, 28, the night, there was a big fire in the Parliament building, National Parliament building. Nobody knows for sure to this day who said it. The powers at the time identified an arsonist, put him through the ringer, and did what the justice system will do. But there's continuing a suspicion that the Nazis may have set that fire in order to give them, a little over a week later, a second emergency law, which empowered the government to issue laws without approval by parliament or president. That was it. 30th of January, 24th of March. That was it. The German democracy, with all its flaws and what have you, all its liberties that they had, was done. So, April 7, we'll get to that a little bit later, that impacted one of my relatives directly. Of course, we all know Jews, communists, and a long list of other people were undesirable. They were to be purged in this particular case with the April 7 law. They were to be purged from government service, and we'll get back to that. So here's a little detail on the two emergency laws that I just described. We'll skip right over that. And here is an important tidbit that got buried in the general and regulations. Initially, in this law for the restoration of the professional civil service, Jews were, of course, declared as non-desirable, must be removed. And initially, that hinged on adherence to the Jewish faith. In a second supplementary decree, it was clarified that it's not so much the faith, but the simple fact that they descended from a person that, or a generation or 2 or 3 earlier, that were of the Jewish faith, that said these are not Aryans, out they must go. I did talk about the dual state. I jumped ahead, my apologies, but I think we've covered that fairly well. And again, the bottom line here, to repeat myself, is that the normative state, marrying, having children, dying, being buried, buying and selling stuff, owning stuff, that was allowed to exist and operate once it was cleansed from the, in the Nazi view, undesirable, if not outright hostile elements, communists, Jews, socialists, social democrats, Roma, Sinti, and the list doesn't end there. Something to keep in mind when we are talking about the prerogative state. It's ideology driven. And we're a church, we are faith driven. But have you ever come across somebody who told you, oh, if you just prayed harder, something good would happen? You just believed more, something good would happen. When we are talking about organizations that inherently focused on an idea, on a faith, there is often that built-in dynamic of you got to believe harder. You got to fight harder for the Nazis. You got to kill the Jews, more of them. This built-in dynamic to radicalize. I haven't seen it at this church, thank the Lord. But in many faiths, think of the certain part of the so-called Christian community in the United States, this drive towards radicalization is built in. It's built into parties. Okay, think back on it takes 5 or 10% of the representatives in a parliament to hold the whole parliament hostage. It's built into any of these kinds of organizations that are not based on a fact. Is the earth flat? Yes or no? I think most of us would agree no. So we can proceed together on that knowledge. But when it comes to matters of intuition, belief, we can't prove it. So there's this built-in dynamic. In daily operation, the prerogative state is built on pervasive surveillance and denunciation. My father is born in 1919, so he is basically a school student in the early years of the Nazi regime. It wasn't a problem in our family, but you could never be sure that anything you said at home wouldn't get blabbered out by a descendant of yours amongst his or her school friends, find its way to teachers, find its way to the state police, the secret state police, and all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, your parent might be picked up and you'd never hear or see that parent again. Pervasive surveillance. Probably the best example of that we have right now is China. And as pertains to China, and John, keep me honest, one of the observations made recently in The Economist is their pervasive is so tool bound. Record everything, record everything, record everything, that in fact they don't have quite as much time to act on the surveillance and the results as they wish. But still, if somebody wants to dig in on, I don't know how we would call it John Doe in China, if somebody wants to target somebody, the information is there and can be found. And there is ultimately no facet of life in the normative state and civil life that is outside the reach of the prerogative state. Just entertainment. and you'll see that occasionally in the American press. There is a new vocabulary that is emerging and that we are learning. Anticipatory compliance. Geez, I'm not going to do that because they might. Or geez, I'm going to do that so they don't. Performative cruelty, I don't think I need to explain. Malicious compliance and uncivil disobedience are a little more entertaining. An example for that that's referenced in this unfortunately paywalled article was a circuit, or a frontline federal judge who was slapped down by the Supreme Court in one of the emergency docket orders, who responded on his next ruling with, okay, they slapped me down, but they didn't change the law. They didn't explain the ruling, which meant they changed the law. So he just continued right on where he was before. Okay, that's an example of what we find in the last two cases. Now, after World War II, how do we know what happened? And how do we, the generation that was born after the war, my eldest sister is born 1948, after our father came back from POW in Russia, how do we know what happened? Somewhat unique, and I think the only effort I can think of is what happened in South Africa once they got rid of their racist regime. Here was instituted a pervasive process to attempt to find anybody who was in any way involved with the Nazi regime, to document what they did, and to mete out punishment. Anybody who was in any way compromised through engagement, I'm going to use that word very gently, with the Nazis, was to be removed from positions and appointments in government, in public life in general. What we have been able to find are the documentation of that process for one of my two grandfathers. And that is much of what we are talking about. Where did I put that? My elder sister spent a lot of time and effort. I told her that's a doctoral dissertation's worth of work, going through the one of our grandfathers and documenting what she found. It's tremendous. This is currently the only existing printed copy. There'll be a very, very limited number, but it's something that we owe our family to not let be forgotten. I'll get to it. Yep. I'm still setting the stage. So the procedure that was put in place in the American sector, the British was similar, the French, and the communists in East Germany did away with this process very quickly. Started with a questionnaire that everybody had to fill out. And based on the results of that questionnaire, they were categorized into one of these 5 categories. From main culprits, that would be, anybody who you may have heard of in the Nuremberg trials, criminal, end of discussion. However, for everybody, guilt was presumed in this process. In other words, once you were categorized as collaborator, mainer, whatever, or if you were fortunate enough to have avoided entanglement as unencumbered, you had to prove that this categorization for you was not correct. And that's what's behind here. Both what the state's attorney said our one grandfather had or had not done, and his justification and explanation of what he did or did not do. I need to give you a little bit of genealogy. I have Jewish ancestors. Down here at the bottom left, that's my paternal grandfather. And you can see from the annotation that he is still a quarter Jewish. We'll also touch upon his sister, Helene, known as Lotte, and his younger brother, Wolfgang. They had interesting experiences. But what do we do? We've got this law for the restoration of the professional civil service. Johann David Fischer, uncle of my grandfather's, is half Jewish. And I promised you earlier I would tell you about an intersect of this law with our family life. In January, so before this law was officially published on the books, he knew he had to declare whether he had Jewish ancestors or not. He was working as a very high-ranking official in the German finance ministry. He was part of the team that had to negotiate, if you can call it that way, the Treaty of Versailles. High-ranking guy. On January 4, 1934, the day he was supposed to go and declare whether he had Jewish ancestors or not, he suffered a heart attack on the way to work. The presumption is that because of what he knew he had to do, couldn't help it, the prerogative state required it, and what the end would be. My great aunt Helene, or Lotte, she worked in public service. She had a Jewish grandmother. She was by any and all definitions Jewish. We don't know precisely what happened, but she had acquired a nickname suggesting that she'd sworn a false oath, and she continued in public service. This is starting to hit close to home.
Is it Mish? There's something Mish. Mishling? You gonna get to that?
I'm not going to go into that terminology.
Okay.
That's.
I've just heard of it.
Yeah. The German terminology is complex enough, and I had a tough time finding good translations for some of this. Okay, so let's continue a little bit with family genealogy. On the left, the two seated portraits is my paternal grandfather. Remember, he's a quarter Jewish, with his wife. And on the right, the two oval pictures are my mother's parents, my maternal grandfathers. Two very, very different families. My father's family have been academics for generations. There's 4 or 5 generations of Lutheran priests, and then they break out, and the next one is a JD. My grandfather Wilhelm, that's where the Wilhelm comes from, was a JD and a banker. In contrast, my mother's family, very solid citizens, smaller towns in a beautiful, beautiful part of Germany, sort of like the rolling hills of Ohio, similar rolling hills, just beautiful. They're merchants, farmers, they worked on city councils and the likes, but totally non-academic. My grandfather Karl, all the way on the right in the oval, he was the first one in his family ever to pursue an academic education and career. And he was good at it. So how do we know what we know? Our parents basically never told us anything. My father's parents died in 1944 and 46 respectively, before my eldest sister was born, so we didn't have a chance to talk with them. We knew our mother's parents. We lived in the same house for about 10, 12 years. And they were absolutely lovely people. We loved spending time with them. They were kind, they were loving, they were open-minded, and we'll see what did. So for Wilhelm and his wife Irmgard, my father's parents, we know very, very little. Family letters from which we can glean one or the other thing, but we really know very, very little. For Grandpa Karl, we have the documentation on what was said about him and how he defended himself. Let's talk about Grandpa Wilhelm first. As I said, died in 1944, quarter Jewish. The flag incidents. And I mentioned earlier, a kid might come home from school and hear something and take it back to school. One of the flag incidents is our father came home from school and all the students had been gifted a Nazi flag. Much to his surprise, again, he was young. What did he know? He earned himself a major, major slap in the face for that. Not much more needed to be said. My father did not know that he had Jewish ancestors and that his father was a quarter Jewish. We didn't figure that one out until the 2000s, when we started digging into all the relatives and said, wait a minute, if he's Jewish, then he's Jewish. So that was not talked about in the family. As I said earlier, his sister, Wilhelm's sister, is supposed to have sworn a false oath that she was not Jewish. It was carefully hidden. We believe, and this is really, rumor, that Wilhelm, who was a major banker, helped Jewish board members to escape to Switzerland. There has been one or the other rumor of suitcases full of cash finding their way into Switzerland. We know nothing concrete about it. We are satisfied that he helped his colleagues escape. As I said several times, he hides his mother's and his own Jewish heritage. And that gets to another point about ideology-driven states. They foster corruption. One of the few things my father ever told me was that he believed that his father, Wilhelm, had an arrangement with the Nazis to protect someone. My father didn't know who. We don't know explicitly who. We strongly believe it was Wilhelm's mother, who lived until she died of natural causes in 1942. And being half Jewish. So he died in 1944 of natural causes, diabetes, kidney failure, 1944 in Berlin, for God's sake. There are no usable records. So we don't know quite of what he died. And he basically retreated into the normative state. Being on the board of this bank, he also ended up on the board, and that's what's sometimes referred to as Germany Incorporated, on the board of many other companies. And we have some indication that that included heavy industry, which would have been material to the conduct of World War II. But he did anything and everything he could to retreat into the normative state and stay away, for obvious reasons, from the prerogative state. Karl is a very different story. Now, Karl is where my K comes from. As I said earlier, the first academic in his family ever, very intellectually curious, a great sketch artist. You may not recognize me since I don't have a beard at that age yet, but that's a sketch he drew of me playing zoo director and proclaiming God knows what to all my stuffed animals. That bear in the bottom left, I still have that bear. I love that bear's facial expression. He doesn't seem to be terribly impressed with what I'm proclaiming. but you also get a sense of the humor in the sense of love for the grandkids that our grandfather had. We've got a whole huge book full of these sketches that he did, and his wife, our grandmother, wrote the text to go with them. It's a treasure. He was also interested very much in the emerging science of cybernetics, feedback loops. And his father was a sergeant in one of the local armies, died young. And the mother had to raise two children, our grandfather and his sister, by herself. Not a rich life by any means, quite a contrast with the Koeppel side of the family. Now, in 1933, he did get his doctorate, cum laude. Beautiful work. We still have copies. He was then employed as a teacher, arts and math, and he was moderately successful at that, and it absolutely did not satisfy his curiosity and his mental energy. So looking for opportunities to advance, and this is where I would like you to remember the question, can you sell your soul to the devil just a little bit? Looking for opportunities to advance, he was told, well, all these folks who are members of one or the other Nazi organization are ahead of you in line. If you want to get ahead and move ahead in your own career, you have to join one of the Nazi organizations. And he joined the General SS, Allgemeine SS, which were the black shirts, brown shirts. It actually didn't help him in the end, but he had sold his soul. In 1937, he applied as a position as a university docent, and he was rejected as for that position as he was not a member of the Nazi Party itself. So in 1937, he joined the Nazi Party. Given his intellectual curiosity, something that always interested him were biological aspects of genealogy. So he volunteered to help people and officials put together people's genealogy. Why was that important? To demonstrate that you had at least 2 generations without somebody Jewish. To demonstrate that if there was mental illness in your family, whether you potentially carried the gene or not. So there was a whole range of, and again, talking about the normative state, owning and operating a farm, selling a farm, only if the other party is sufficiently Aryan. So all over life, on almost anything you can think of, the question of ancestry and genealogy became important. And him being a teacher, and not just a teacher, but a very well-educated and well-read teacher, it was a natural for teachers at that time to be drafted into helping to develop these genealogies. Involved a lot of reading old church membership rolls and what have you. So somebody really needed to be able to read, and not just neatly printed stuff as they had at the time, but handwritten stuff from old record books. In 1933 and lasting through 1936, he was assigned guardianship of a schizoid alcoholic. Not clear that he could do much for him. However, one of the side effects of that we became acutely aware of is he had to visit mental health hospitals where this person was a patient. And thinking of his work, biology, genealogy, he must have noticed that the patients at 2 of the institutions that he visited were constantly disappearing. One of the two is known to have overachieved their quota for removing mentally ill patients into the Nazi death machine. We know that now. At the time, all our grandfather would have seen is that there was a constant turnover in patients, and patients that were there 1 month weren't there the next month, instead another round of patients. These two facilities were basically operated as way stations into the death machine at that time. That, to us, was hard to take. It's not the gentleman we knew. That's not the man we knew. We knew a loving, kind, cheerful, sweet, intellectually, very engaged man. He developed a mechanism based on the feedback loop theory that I mentioned earlier to help stutterers. He had observed that if a person stutters, they may do so when speaking, but not when singing. So he used that to develop a whole process on how to help people who stutter. And I found it interesting. 4 or 5 years ago, I saw a study. When you equip a stutterer with headphones and a microphone and make them listen to their own voice delayed, many of them stop stuttering. So our grandfather was onto something in his observation. Just, the equipment wasn't there to demonstrate it all and to build on it, but he was onto something. That's the man we knew. This learning that he very likely knew what was happening to the mentally ill people was a very hard pill to swallow. Now, again, based on his process, we do know that he was able to prevent and reverse a small number of hereditary mental illness designations, which would have meant that a person so designated, in you go, out you go, and we know where. And he got sucked into something he didn't understand when he started. You can't sell your soul to the devil just a little bit. The devil will take it all in the end. He eventually did honorary work for the agricultural ministry. And again, genealogies, that was his specialty. And in this particular case, you had to be racially pure in order to be able to acquire or operate a farm. Heaven forbid a pure German eats grain or bread that was grown on a farm that was not owned by a pure German. This is just crazy. This did place him in the vicinity of eugenics. And today we look at eugenics and we say, hell no. But in the 1930s, eugenics was in the Western world a widely accepted public health policy. Today, thank goodness, we say, over my dead body. But then it was considered acceptable. Now, he joins eventually the so-called Sicherheitsdienst, security service of the General SS, on the assumption that that was put in place to provide an unfiltered view of how the people at large react and position themselves with respect to the Nazi regime. And that seems to be more or less correct based on what we know, that this was really a very unusual group in the General SS that in fact was expected to collect and pass up the chain here's what it's really like. Initially on a voluntary basis, and eventually he gets delegated from teaching full-time, 1940. And he is then assigned to participate in establishing a German educational system in Alsace. For those of you who have a rough sense of German-French geography, you've got the Rhine. On the right hand is Germany, on the left hand is France, and the province on the left hand, if you look at a map, is Alsace. Has been fought over between Germany and France for, well, ever since it was established in the late 800s or thereabouts. Came part of the middle son of Charlemagne, of his slice of Europe. Originally, the German population has been heavily Francicized over the centuries. It's a mixed population today, and thank goodness we're not fighting over it anymore. This is incidentally where my parents met. Karl and his wife Else had a very open house where they would regularly invite local people, students from the university, local dignitaries, anybody who wanted to come to just enjoy some coffee and probably cake and talk. You can think of it as a semi-literary salon in its then current expression. My father was a medical student at the University of Strasbourg, and a fellow student of him said, hey, you ought to go and join that get-together. The daughter of the house is remarkable. And that's how my parents met. So. Going back to Karl, he encountered disciplinary issues. He's in the organization that's supposed to provide an unfiltered view up the chain, which he does. And in the process, he uses a very accurate, and we might call it scathing, description of a Nazi official. And he was also accused, and I see this in conjunction with the afternoon coffee and cake sessions that they had, of being too enmeshed with the local population. That was a no-no. He was supposed to be there as part of the regime, instituting a German-style educational system, of course adhering to the ideology while we are at it. And that does not include what we might call, in a slightly different context, fraternizing with the enemy. Okay. So he ended up, and we don't have anything more about this, imprisoned 6 months in 1943. And then he was transferred to Bayreuth in 1944, but for what should have been disciplinary proceedings. We don't know much about that. We haven't been able to find much about it. The denazification procedure that I earlier described, he was initially considered to be a major collaborator. Based on the work he had done, genealogy, biology, party member. He actually never collected his party membership book, but on the books he was a party member. He was a member of the General SS, of the General SS-SD. So he was considered a major collaborator and interned. And eventually, with lots of letters from folks who knew his work, trying to, as we might say today, take the sharpest edge off the work he had to do. He was eventually classified as a minor collaborator and suitable for probation. Now, here's something about the denazification process that isn't necessarily easy to find. The process was supposed to be conducted by Germans. How do you find, after this time, a German who hasn't in some fashion been entangled with the Nazi regime? And as it turns out, the new government had tremendous problems finding people who were clearly not encumbered by entanglement with the Nazi regime. It was just so pervasive that conducting these denazification processes became very, very difficult. But they did them. The Americans carried them on the longest, the Brits a little bit longer, the French, and the communists gave up on them very, very quickly. In a nutshell, to put a positive spin on it, Karl engaged with a prerogative state for personal opportunity and development. He wanted to be more than a teacher. He wanted to be a docent at a university. It didn't work out for him, but that's what motivated him to engage. One of the interesting things in the documentation he wrote is he believed initially into the social aspect of the Nazi Party, the SNS, National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party. That's what the initials stand for. He believed in the social work that they promised. Not an unreasonable thing to do. But at the same time, Hitler has never been shy about his hate of Jews and beginning in 1933, after he came to power, every couple that was married was given a gift by the state, a copy of Mein Kampf. Did they read it? I don't know. But Hitler and his ideology were not secret. I have to leave that hanging. Something that totally blew my mind when after the war I heard somebody say, well, the Nazis weren't all bad. They restored economic order. They did. Delivered political stability. They did. You may not like the expression of it, but they delivered it. They gave Germany the Autobahn and Volkswagen, and. So my question here is, how many meters of Autobahn justify the life of a single Jew? Any dictatorship you find, any regime you find, you will find something where you are tempted to say, yeah, that needed to be done, that is right. Don't give in to the temptation of saying just because that needed to be done and is right, to let that offset all the other stuff that's just not right then, now, or ever. Some things you just cannot trade off without compromising yourself as a decent person. Martin Niemöller was a Lutheran priest in Germany during the time. And after the war, he was interned in a concentration camp, but he survived in the end. He gave a little remembrance. And the precise words that he used, he didn't remember himself. So I have 3 versions of it here. But it's worth, I'll read the first one here explicitly. When they jailed the communists, nobody said anything because we weren't communists. And by the way, the communists were bad, so jailing them was probably a good thing to do. Didn't say that part. And we agreed to have these enemies of the church out of the way. Oops, there is the, and that was the right thing to happen part. And we didn't see ourselves obligated yet to say anything for the people outside the church. That wasn't customary then. And we hadn't gotten so far to know ourselves responsible for our people. Slightly different version. The communists, we let that pass calmly. In the labor unions, we let that pass also. The Social Democrats, we let that pass also. None of that was our problem. The church as a organization is when he says our, and the priests. This is the version that is probably best known. It comes from the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in Great Britain. And let's read it. I'll read it out to you. We've got a couple minutes before the hour is up. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Same sentiment again. Not me. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. The article that I linked here at the bottom, I think it's also paywalled, basically suggests we need to read this poem backwards. When they come for me, is there anybody who is still left who I should have spoken up for so that they could now speak up for me? How far is too far? That is the question I leave you with. How far, when dealing with an ideology-driven regime, how far is too far? When do they cross a point that you can't go along with? I have my own answer to that, but I'll leave it to you to come up with yours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Anything I can try to shed a little bit more light on? Doug.
Comment, you and your family history, all the presentations I've been to by other people, a lot of the military officers that worked for Hitler, especially in the German Navy, were at least half Jewish.
Yeah.
And he overlooked it. I mean, they were.
Question is, did they admit to it?
Some of them, yes. That's the kicker. And isn't there something about Adolf's grandparent? He's like 1/8 Jewish, but they erased the records.
I believe so, yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Where he acquired this virulent hate, and that's not even an adequate description of Jews, I don't know. It is just so far out of the realm of anything I can relate to.
You can't comprehend it.
Yeah.
But we're seeing it now.
Yeah.
And it won't be such a big question as how did they get Germany to be like that?
Yeah.
Well,
And tying this back to one of the forums that Darlene gave about members of Trinity serving in World War II, my comment to her was, how many millions of lives were lost to rid the world of this monster?
It took Germany, what, 10 years to get to that state, maybe?
2.5 months. In 2.5 months, from January 28, if memory serves me, 1933, to March 14th or something like that, 1933, the 2 emergency decrees, that was it. Germany was, as a Western liberal democracy, was done. It didn't exist anymore. And one of the things my sister was able to figure out is, I mentioned earlier, 1923, I think it was, Hitler tried to overthrow the Bavarian government, which earned him some prison time. The Nazi Party established before they came to power in 1933 over the years leading up to 33, they established their political organization of the German nation. You know, there were states, like we know them stateside. They replaced them with something called a Gau, which is, you know, just a region, a German name for a region. And they obliterated the states as a governing entity. They had those orders and who was going to step into what position laid out for years before they came to power. That, of course, made it easy on top of the two emergency declarations, emergency, right? I'm tempted to say emergency, my butt. Two emergency declarations and that preparation enabled them to obliterate the German state government system, states like the US, in no time flat. So yeah, there was preparation, but the tipping point were those 2.5 months at the beginning of 1933. And that's all it took, 2.5 months. Anything else? Anything else I can depress you with? Please, please, please.
Recently, after the elections last Tuesday, I was listening to some commentary that said statistically, and I don't know if this is true, and I don't know where it came from, but it said if 35% of if at least 35% of the population rejects it and comes back and against whatever is happening politically, it will stop an authoritarian effort. And then they went on to say that the no kings that we've experienced has been really helpful in getting that kind of population to rise up against what's happening now. So I guess the answer is hit the streets every time you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.